Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to show you my fat pixels, specifically my Leaf Aptus 22 medium format digital back. This is what you'd call a fat pixel sensor due to its pretty large pixels, measuring in at 9 microns by 9 microns. If those numbers seem just like random numbers, well, consider this. A modern high-resolution full-frame camera like the Sony a7R V have those pixels measuring in at 3.73 by 3.73 microns. To contextualize what that means and how much bigger the Aptus 22 pixels are, you can almost fit 6 entire Sony a7R V pixels in the surface area of one Aptus 22 pixel. In this video, we're going to go over why I love shooting on this digital back, and we'll see whether or not it's worth looking at it if you're interested in some big old CCD sensors. So what is the Leaf Aptus 22? Well, this is a medium format digital back brought to you by the people at Leaf Creo, or Creo, I don't know. Leaf, I'm gonna call it that. And it is a 22 megapixel sensor produced by Dalsa. It is a CCD sensor, and it was introduced in 2005. The CCD comes in at a whopping 48 millimeters by 36 millimeters. That's 2 times the surface area of full frame cameras. And again, it has the aforementioned fat pixels, 9 by 9 microns. Just a bit of context here. I'm going to show you what this sensor size is like compared to a Micro Four Thirds camera. Oop. So if we have a look here, this is the sensor on the medium format camera. And this is the sensor on my Panasonic GH4. It is a bit of a different size. Wouldn't you agree? Now, this sensor, the Aptus 22, has a sensitivity from ISO 25 to 400. That's right, its base ISO is 25. It can take can take exposures for up to 30 seconds. Additionally, the digital back saves its RAWs at 16 bits per channel, and shooting tops out at an incredible 0.9 FPS, and it can continue doing that forever. Crazy speedy. Now, here's the thing about these cameras. I had mentioned earlier, about 30 seconds ago, that the maximum exposure time is 30 seconds, and I mean that. These cameras, this digital back, it didn't do long exposures particularly well. This was kind of common for CCDs at the time. Now, the back that I have here specifically is the one meant to mount on Mamiya 645 AFD cameras, or Phase One 645 DF cameras. However, this back comes in other mount varieties, such as Hasselblad, I believe H mount, or V mount, one of the Hasselblad mounts, and Contax AFD. The rear of the back, it features a surprisingly chunky 6 by 7 centimeter color display. And it has a resolution of 230 kDots. Pretty good for the time. On top of that, this is made out of future space tech. It's a touchscreen. Mind you, it's a 1-point resistive touchscreen, but it is touch. The digital back obviously saves images to a CF card slot over here. And it supports live view, also a future technology. Kind of. It only does it when it's tethered to computer using FireWire, and it apparently looks pretty janky. I don't know, because I don't have a FireWire cable that will work, and I don't have a computer that has a powered FireWire, so we're not gonna be reviewing that aspect of the camera today. Additionally, believe it or not, this also supports wireless image transfer, kind of, on Bluetooth and only with a ancient device called the Pocket PC, and only running Leaf's app for that, which I also don't have, so we're not going to get into that. Now, on its own, without a body or lens, this digital camera back weighs in at 600 grams, or roughly 0.6 plana. The back itself takes a fairly common Samsung SB L160 battery, or you can use the chunkier L320 batteries, a battery that is still kind of common today. When it was new, this camera back sold with an MSRP of $24,995 in US buckaroos. In now dollars, that's about $42,000, a bit less than a Honda Civic Type R. Basically, it costs about the same as all the maple syrup in Canada. Before we get started into the review, there are some caveats about this camera back if you are considering it. Two that come to mind. One, it's very common for the clock battery to die. No big deal, right? Just swap the battery out. Incorrect. It is a deal of some size. It turns out the battery, or clock battery in this case, is not easily replaceable. It is technically doable. It's not soldered in or anything. However, it does require near complete teardown of this digital back. And that's kind of annoying. Again, not undoable. Basically, if you're used to working on undoing flat flex cables, undoing stacked circuit boards, you should be fine. It's just kind of deep in there. Luckily, there's no desoldering and resoldering required. But again, it's a real pain in the ass if you are annoyed by that kind of thing. The other thing is that this sensor, it's huge. You may have noticed that. So when you take the sensor back off, or when you take the back off camera, it's exposed. And it's not super uncommon for digital backs of this age to have a minor ding on the glass cover on top of the sensor. Now, if you are a perfectionist, this may drive you mad. However, 99% of the time, this won't affect the image, so I don't really mind if it results in me getting a good deal on one of these things. But again, things to consider since these sensors are quite huge and they come off the camera, so they're exposed a lot if users remove the backs from different camera systems. So, now you've got one of these backs. How do you use this thing? Well, luckily you got a couple options. If you followed my channel a bit, you know that I've attached my digital back to a variety of cameras, from, camera that I built and designed myself to a adapter that I made so I could use a digital back on a Mamiya Super 23. Now, these cameras, or these sensors, are actually fairly versatile. Basically, as long as you can jam the camera onto an appropriate mount and sync it with something, specifically usually a PC port of some sort, you can probably get the camera to trigger and take a picture on whatever you have it attached to. Again, look at my older videos, look at my first one ever. I attached this to a view camera that I made and 3D printed. And I synced it to a large format lens that had a leaf shutter and a PC sync port. Now, that being said, the most straightforward way to do it probably is to jam it onto the back of a camera that it's designed for. Again, in the case of my Mamiya mount 645 digital back, I put it on a Phase One 645 DF+, but it'll also work on Mamiya 645 AFD series cameras. But again, most of the time this actually lives on my Super 23. Now, the modularity of these systems is kind of a big strength, and I love it for that, since I can choose whatever platform I want to shoot on, and basically instead of shooting film now, I now have a digital camera, which I find quite convenient and quite nice. And if I don't have an adapter for it readily available, chances are it's not going to be that hard to make one for it, and I'll just design, print, and then test it. Now, this does come with a couple downsides. If you do, use one of these digital backs, clearly you're not going to get a weather-sealed camera. Heck, the Aptus 22 has a cooling fan on it, and it is right here. And that, when I open it up, it is blowing directly onto the circuit board. So yeah, you pour water in there, that's the end of that. So, things to consider. Additionally, this thing, it's a bit clunky, even on the camera that it's made for. There's been a couple times where I've taken a picture, maybe I pressed the shutter too fast, and I get an error on the camera or an error on the digital back. And it seems to be that looking back at some forums, this was normal for the time. Another thing that's a bit clunky about it is that even though it takes this giant battery, the camera that I normally use it on that is meant for the digital back, this thing, the Phase One, it needs to have a separate power source for the camera itself. So I ended up loading up a lithium-ion battery for the digital back and 6 AA batteries for the camera itself. Again, newer Phase One XF cameras, I think, can do power sharing. Probably not with an old back like that, but I don't have one of those because those are really, really, really expensive, and I'm not made out of money yet. Although I have hope. I hope that one day I bleed $100 bills. Then maybe I'll have one of those. All right, first off, everything is slow on the Aptus 22. Now, when I say slow, I mean it. So if you're not used to like an SLR powering up, or not used to older mirrorless cameras like taking a second or two to boot up, you are probably not going to enjoy this. Let's time how long it takes for this to actually power up. I'm going to press the power button now, and oh, there we go. Now, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, 9-ish seconds before it went to ready to shoot. And I don't know if you can hear that. You maybe not be able to hear it, but the fan is spinning, so it is not a silent experience. Now, even doing things like reviewing images on this is a bit slow. Now, actually previewing them compressed on the screen, not too bad, kind of quick, but let's say you want to zoom in. I'm going to tap it, and I'm going to touch it and switch the back to face you, and in that time, it will not have loaded the picture. Here. See that loading? Look at that go. Wow. Several seconds there. That being said, overall, navigating the menu, it's not actually super slow, and it's actually kind of nice to navigate. It's got big, chunky, touch buttons, and it's fairly straightforward. And it should be, because there's not that much to change on these digital backs. Basically, you can change your ISO, you can tell it what kind of camera system you have it connected to, and you can tell it what kind of RAW file you want to save. You can also do things like renaming your file names, that kind of stuff. Overall, a straightforward, simple menu system. Here's another thing to consider when you're using these digital backs. Now, again, you're probably going to assume that if you're using one of these expensive digital back systems and you're pairing it with something like one of these 645 DF Pluses, that you probably have an advanced, quick autofocus system. This camera body is actually one of the newer ones. It's not the newest one, like I said, but I bet you'd be surprised to find out that this has only one focus point. It's nice, it's accurate, but it's one, and it's not that quick. There's more slowness to be had in the system overall. Now, I admit this might sound a bit awful. and at times it is. But honestly, when it's on the SLR body and you know, you're aware it's not a quick shooting experience, you kind of just adapt to the slowness. This is especially true if you're coming from like a modern mirrorless camera that, you know, it's able to shoot 60 FPS with a buffer depth of 1 billion photos. So going from that to one of these much slower medium format systems, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I thought it would annoy me more than it did. But really, it just kind of made me think a little more deliberately about what I was shooting and, you know, not just try to hope that I can spray and pray and get a reasonable shot. So I didn't mind the change of pace. On top of that, because this LCD on the camera is a older style display, you actually don't have time to, you know, look through and wait for the camera to load 1 billion photos anyways, so the slowness might not be a bad thing. In daylight, this LCD is borderline useless. Worst case scenario, you get a washed out image and it's hard to look at. Or not the worst case, best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you literally can't see anything without like some sort of hood. Luckily, I bought this secondhand, and the previous owner was nice enough to give me this little bellows that clips onto the digital back, and I can use that to kind of provide some shade in the daylight to check stuff. But, you know, if you don't have one of these, it is honestly impossible to use. But again, this is something that I kind of learned to not mind as I kind of focused on using the camera rather than reviewing every single image. Now, this is where combine all this slowness together with this kind of simple SLR experience, and it kind of goes back to, weirdly enough, feeling like you're shooting film. There's a lot less looking at the rear of your screen. There's way more limitations. Again, ISO range is 25 to 400, and you know, it's a big change from when you're used to a mirrorless camera, which will take perfectly fine images at ISO 12,800. So again, when I'm out with this camera and I'm trying to like take the shot, I'm more thinking, how much room do I have to change settings really? And what can I do to still get that photo that I want? Sometimes I'm just not going to be able to get it and I'll need to think of something else, but sometimes it pays off and I get something I really like. Now, again, this slowing down, I find it quite nice because overall, while I am shooting less photos, I'm generally keeping more of the photos I actually shoot, which I find a nice experience. Now, another thing to consider is when you're using this camera with the SLR, you already heard this on its own, 600 grams. When you have it with the SLR and a lens, you're easily looking at 1.5 2 kilos depending on the lens that you got. So it is not light, and it's not particularly compact. It is in fact humongous. There's actually only like maybe 1 or 2 bags I own, and I own a lot of bags that'll comfortably fit it in like a pouch or in one of the messenger. I have one messenger bag style that'll fit the digital back and the SLR body in there with one lens. And again, it's one of those things where you learn just to pack one lens, one thing that you want to shoot, and frame everything up with that. So again, more limitations. And, you know, again, when I'm shooting with this camera, I'm aware of that, and I kind of like it. Because again, it's really gotten me to slow down and appreciate what I'm shooting. Shooting with the Aptus 22 image quality. As I mentioned, this sensor has big old pixels and not a particularly big pixel count. Now, combine that with the fact that this sensor doesn't have an AA filter on top of it, and its base ISO is 25, translates to a couple awesome things. The apparent sharpness and the resolution the sensor can deliver is frankly incredible at 22 megapixels. It may be a camera that I personally think the sensor punches quite a bit above its weight, given that there are now modern full-frame sensors that pack many, many more pixels into a much smaller size. Now, another side benefit of these big pixels is that you don't really need super crazy lenses to resolve pretty awesome detail and max out the resolving power of the sensor. I mean, that said, most of the lenses for the system that I'm using, the Phase One Mamiya system, perform very well anyways, but that's something to consider for the camera system as a whole. Now, the base ISO and the fact that the camera, even in 2005, already did things like record RAW using 16 bits per channel means that the dynamic range of this camera in 2005 was straight up insane at the time of release. I mean, at this point, it's pretty on par with a lot of more modern sensors. Again, it's not going to be nearly as good as a modern backside illuminated CMOS on full frame cameras, but it's still more than usable. And that 16-bit depth means that, that 16-bit depth is something that we're seeing, just come in now to backside illuminated CMOS cameras. And in 2005, this was the norm for medium format sensors. Now, the other thing is that this sensor, despite being quite gigantic, is actually a tad smaller than on 645. So there is a bit of a crop, and the result is that many medium format lenses, which are already fairly good, appear even better as the corners get just a tiny bit cut out. Now, it's actually not as severe as like a crop on 1.5 crop on full frame. It's more like 1.15 or 1.2. So it's actually pretty mild. So you do get the benefit of shaving off the edges of the frame, but also the benefit of not super impacting your field of view. Now, I'm not normally one to comment on color unless I'm specifically comparing sensors, but I personally find that the colors on the Aptus 22 are quite nice. The leaf color science at the time, just awesome. In one word. Not really true to life, but a lot of saturation and a lot of like pop in the images, which, may not be what you're looking for, but it's what I like. When I combine this with my adapted cameras, it kind of brings me back to kind of a quality of filminess. I don't know. I don't really think that's what it is, but it makes me not care that I'm not shooting film on these cameras anymore. Recommendation. So this digital back, the Aptus 22, it's a bit of a hard thing to recommend. Not because it's bad, it's the opposite. As a shooting experience with the giant CCD, it's amazing. But there's other things to consider. These digital backs are still pretty expensive, nowhere near the original MSRP, but the Aptus 22 routinely sells for around 1,000 USD, with newer variants like the Aptus 2 version going for around 1,200 to 1,500 USD, which is a lot of money that only gets you partway towards a usable camera. And if you consider the additional cost of getting either an adapter to adapt a camera you already have, or getting one of the supported camera bodies, you could easily be out several hundred more dollars. Like at the time of writing, the 645 DF Plus routinely goes for around 750 USD. And I'm assuming if you need one of those bodies, you probably need another lens. So add on top a pretty common 80mm f2.8, and altogether you're probably down $2,000, which, you know, it doesn't sound too bad when you compare it against like the Fujifilm GFX-50 or GFX-100, which are kind of more money, or in the ballpark of. But admittedly, the GFX lenses, they're still pretty pricey. So, you know, give or take there. That being said, the GFX cameras offer a much more modern mirrorless shooting experience, so shooting them isn't as easy a comparison as you'd kind of think. Now, another thing to consider when thinking about these medium format digital backs is rarity. Part of the rarity probably comes from the fact that the original MSRP was so high, meaning that they probably didn't sell a huge amount of these things, which means that nowadays in the used market, it's not really flush with digital backs. So finding one isn't that easy. I've hardly seen any that are confirmed working for sale on the E of Bays. Sometimes you see them on the MPBs, sometimes on KEH, but really you don't see a lot of them around. Now, another thing, again, to consider, and it makes it hard to recommend, is like support. These cameras don't tend to have a lot of support behind them anymore. A lot of the times it's because it's like super old and discontinued, but even like online forum support. If you look at my older videos on like the Nikon D200, Fujifilm S3, or Olympus E1, heck, even like some of the Kodak cameras, you'll find that there's still somewhat of an active community, or at least a lot of resources from the past that you could look into if you're having issues with your camera, since they sold them in a more volume than they sold these things. Not to say that there's no support there, but it's much more limited. So, there's a lot of things to consider. But that being said, if you are looking for specifically a big CCD sensor and you like medium format stuff, and if you already have a 645 AFD or something, or another supported film SLR, depending on which version of the back you're looking for, this could be an excellent buy, especially if you're getting tired of spending money on 120 film. This could lead to you getting some neat photos and speeding up your workflow. Now, I'll admit, when I was looking around for a digital back initially, part of the reason was because 120 film is just expensive. Like, everything about it is expensive. Buying 120 film is expensive, processing 120 film is expensive, and even though there's been a recent resurgence in it, it actually seems to have gotten more expensive and not less. So, I figure that, combined with the fact that 120 film turnaround times in the area where I'm at aren't super fast, why bother continuing to sink money into film? I can just spend a lot of money all at once and, get a digital sensor and not deal with that. And after I got this, I haven't looked back. In fact, I have continued to hilariously make financial missteps, and I bought the Phase One P45 digital back, which you might remember from some of my walk and talk or walk and shoot videos. I'll probably end up doing a full video on that later. Now, I understand that If you're shooting film right now, you're probably shooting film for the sake of shooting film. And this isn't going to be the answer for you. But if you're a weirdo like me and you shoot film not necessarily for the experience of getting film, but more for the experience of being forced to slow down, then the Aptus 22 and generally medium format backs do this very well. Now, again, if you're shooting film because you're shooting film and you like the negatives and the physicality of it, this won't change that. But again, if you're a weirdo like me and you just want to be forced to take a breather, this is seriously worth an option or worth a look. To conclude, if you want to experience both a huge CCD and fat pixels, the Aptus 22, this is the way. Now, be prepared to slow right down when you're shooting, but take that slowness and embrace it. And if you find one that's in good condition and are willing to pay the price, it'll probably deliver you many excellent images from now to many, many years from now. These cameras or these sensors still produce great images 20 some odd years into the future. And, you know, they are lovely pieces of equipment. But that's just my opinion. What do you think of the Aptus 22 or of digital backs in general? Do you want one? Do you have one? Or, do you not care? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.